There's a specific line that, once crossed, changes something permanently in a super empath. Not a single dramatic betrayal, not the obvious offenses everyone expects, but something quieter, something most people would never even think to avoid, precisely because it doesn't look like a mistake at all in the moment it happens. Today we're talking about that one emotional mistake, the single thing a super empath, once evolved past the early stages of overgiving and endless second chances, simply does not forgive. And why, once you understand it, you'll realize it explains relationships that ended abruptly, seemingly over nothing, when actually it was over the one thing that mattered most. Let's start by ruling out the mistakes people usually assume would top this list, because understanding what doesn't break a super empath's trust is just as important as understanding what does. It isn't anger, expressed honestly, even when it's uncomfortable. A super empath, having done real work on their own emotional regulation, tends to have remarkable tolerance for someone else's genuine, unfiltered anger, as long as it's honest rather than manipulative. It isn't a mistake, even a significant one, openly acknowledged super empaths, precisely because they've learned to distinguish real accountability from performance, tend to be genuinely, sometimes surprisingly forgiving toward people who mess up and own it cleanly, without excuses. It isn't even distance or need for space or an inability to be emotionally available at every single moment. A super empath's own hard-won boundaries have taught them to respect the same need for space in others without automatically interpreting it as rejection. The actual unforgivable mistake is this: making them doubt their own perception deliberately in a moment when they were right. I want to walk through why this specific violation lands so differently than almost anything else, because on the surface, it doesn't sound as severe as betrayal, cruelty, or abandonment. But for a super empath specifically, this particular act cuts against the exact foundation their entire evolved self was built on top of. Remember what a super empath actually is, at the core of everything we've discussed across this entire series. Someone who has spent years, sometimes decades, learning to trust their own read of situations, their own internal sense of what's actually happening beneath the surface of events, after long periods of either doubting that perception entirely or having it directly undermined by people close to them. The entire architecture of their evolved stability rests on this hard-won trust in their own accuracy. The ability to say internally, with total confidence, I know what I saw, I know what I heard, I know what actually happened, without requiring anyone else's agreement to hold that knowledge steady. So when someone, especially someone close to them, someone whose opinion genuinely matters, deliberately works to convince a super empath that their accurate perception was wrong, specifically in a moment when it wasn't wrong at all, they're not committing an ordinary interpersonal offense. They're attacking the single load-bearing structure the super empath's entire hard-won stability depends on. This is why this specific violation produces a response so different from almost anything else that could happen in a relationship with them. Because it isn't experienced as, they hurt my feelings. It's experienced as, they tried to take away the one thing I fought hardest to build. Let's talk about what this actually looks like in practice, because it rarely announces itself as dramatically as the description might suggest. It's the person who, after clearly provably doing something they said they wouldn't do, insists with total confidence that it never happened, or that it happened completely differently than the super empath remembers, delivered with enough conviction to require the super empath to actually stop and question their own memory, even briefly, even for a moment. It's the friend who, after a clear pattern of unreliability finally gets named directly, responds not with acknowledgement, but with an elaborate reframing designed specifically to make the super empath feel like they're the one being unreasonable for noticing a pattern that was, by any objective measure, completely real. It's the partner who, confronted with a specific, accurate observation about their behavior, doesn't simply disagree. Disagreement is fine. Disagreement is human, but instead works to actively destabilize the super empath's confidence in their own ability to observe reality accurately at all, using tone, repetition, and sheer persistence to blur something that was, before the conversation started, completely clear. Here's why this specific act is so much more damaging in the eyes of a super empath than almost any other relational offense. It doesn't just hurt them in the moment it happens. It threatens to undo years of internal work that took an enormous amount of effort and pain to build in the first place. Every other kind of hurt, anger, disappointment, even betrayal can be processed using the exact tools a super empath has spent years developing. Observe the pattern, trust your own read, respond from a place of stability rather than reactivity. But this specific violation targets the tools themselves. It's not an attack on the super empath's feelings. It's an attack on their instrument of perception, the very thing that makes all their other stability possible in the first place. This is why, once this specific line gets crossed, something shifts permanently, in a way that's genuinely different from how a super empath responds to almost any other kind of hurt. Where other offenses might be processed, forgiven, integrated into an ongoing relationship with appropriate boundaries adjusted accordingly, this one tends to produce something closer to complete, permanent reclassification, not because the super empath is being unusually harsh or unforgiving in general, but because this specific act reveals something the super empath cannot unknow. That this particular person is willing, when it serves them, to attack the exact foundation the super empath depends on to protect themselves from every other kind of manipulation. Once that's been revealed, no amount of subsequent good behavior in other areas can fully restore the sense of safety that existed before, because the super empath now knows, with certainty, that under the right pressure, this person will reach for exactly this tool again. I want to talk about why this specific act is so much more common than people realize, and why so many people commit it without ever fully understanding the severity of what they've actually done. Very few people who do this are cartoonishly malicious, consciously plotting to destabilize someone else's grip on reality for sport. Far more often, this happens because the person doing it is deeply uncomfortable with being seen accurately in a specific moment. Caught in a lie, confronted with a pattern they don't want to acknowledge, exposed in a way that feels genuinely threatening to their own sense of self, and reaching for the nearest available tool to make that discomfort go away, which often means undermining the accuracy of the person doing the seeing, rather than addressing the actual behavior that prompted the accurate observation in the first place. This means the severity of the act in the moment it happens is rarely intentional in the sense of a calculated long-term strategy. It's usually a reflexive defensive maneuver, deployed without much conscious thought about what it's actually doing to the other person's fundamental sense of trust in their own mind. But here's the crucial thing a super empath has learned, through years of hard experience, that most people never fully absorb. Intent doesn't actually change impact, and a defensive reflex that happens to target someone's core perceptual stability is just as damaging, regardless of whether it was consciously calculated or simply an automatic, panicked response to being accurately seen. I want to say something important about why this specific reaction, permanent reclassification after this one particular offense, isn't actually harshness or an overcorrection on the super empath's part, even though it can look that way to people who don't understand the mechanism underneath it. A super empath who has done the real work to trust their own perception has usually arrived there only after surviving genuine gaslighting, genuine reality distortion, genuine periods where their own accurate read of a situation got systematically undermined until they could barely trust anything they observed at all. Having survived that experience once and having done the enormous difficult work required to rebuild trust in their own mind afterward, A super empath understandably treats any repeat attempt at that exact same violation as categorically different from ordinary relational conflict, because they know, with hard-won clarity, exactly how much it costs to rebuild what gets damaged when this specific line gets crossed, and they are simply no longer willing to risk that rebuilding process again for someone who's already demonstrated they're willing to attempt the exact same violation once. And this is exactly where we're headed in the second half of this conversation. How to recognize, in real time, the moment someone is attempting this specific violation against you. The subtle difference between honest disagreement and deliberate perception. Undermining, and why understanding this one unforgivable mistake might be the single most important piece of self-protection a super empath, or anyone working to become one, can ever learn. Let's talk about how to actually recognize this specific violation in real time, because the ability to catch it as it's happening, rather than only understanding it in hindsight, is what actually protects a super empath from repeated exposure to this exact wound. Here's the first distinguishing feature, and it's the most important one to internalize. Honest disagreement engages with the specific content of what happened, while perception undermining attacks your capacity to know anything at all. This distinction sounds abstract, but it becomes very concrete once you know what to listen for. Honest disagreement sounds like, "I remember that conversation differently. I don't think I said it quite that way. Here's what I actually recall." It's specific. It's engaging with the actual substance of the disagreement, and crucially, it leaves room for the possibility that both people might be partially right, partially mistaken, without either person's fundamental capacity to perceive reality being called into question. Perception undermining sounds categorically different. You always do this. You're remembering things again. This is exactly why nobody can have a normal conversation with you. Notice what's happening in these phrases. They're not actually engaging with the specific event at all. They're making a global claim about the super empath's reliability as an observer of reality, which is an entirely different and far more damaging move than simply disagreeing about what happened in one particular instance. The second distinguishing feature, honest disagreement, can tolerate the conversation ending in unresolved uncertainty, while perception undermining requires total capitulation before it stops. This is one of the clearest tells available, and it's worth watching for specifically. Someone engaged in honest disagreement can eventually say, "Okay, we remember this differently. Let's just agree we see it differently and move forward." An ending that leaves both people's perception intact, even if unreconciled. Someone engaged in deliberate perception undermining cannot tolerate that same ending, because the actual goal was never to reach a mutual understanding of a specific event. The goal was to win a war over whose version of reality gets to be the official one, which means the conversation will keep escalating, keep circling back, keep applying pressure, until the super empath either fully capitulates to the other person's version, or the conversation reaches an explosive breaking point, because a stalemate where both perceptions remain equally valid was never an acceptable outcome to the person doing the undermining in the first place. The third distinguishing feature, and this one requires the most internal awareness to catch, notice the specific physical and emotional sensation of the moment your own certainty starts to waver. And ask yourself honestly whether that wavering is being produced by genuinely new information or simply by pressure and repetition. This is crucial because deliberate perception undermining often works precisely by exploiting a healthy, normally adaptive trait, the willingness to reconsider your own view when presented with new evidence. The problem is that this specific manipulation doesn't actually offer new evidence. It offers repetition, confidence, and social pressure disguised as if it were evidence, hoping that sheer persistence alone will accomplish what actual counter-evidence never could. Learning to distinguish, "I'm reconsidering because I just heard something that actually changes the facts," from I'm reconsidering because this person is being very insistent and I'm tired of the discomfort of disagreeing with them is one of the single most protective skills a super empath can develop because it allows the wavering itself to become useful data, a signal that manipulation might be happening, rather than simply being experienced as confusion to be resolved by giving in. Now, I want to talk about what to actually do once you've correctly identified that this specific violation is happening, because recognition alone, while necessary, isn't sufficient protection on its own. The first response, in the actual moment it's happening, is to simply stop engaging with the content of the argument and name the pattern instead. Something as direct as, I'm not going to keep debating what actually happened because I know what I experienced and I'm not interested in being talked out of that. Delivered calmly, without needing to win any further point, without needing the other person's agreement to end the conversation there. This single move does something important. It refuses to grant the conversation the one thing it needs in order to succeed, which is your continued participation in a debate whose actual goal was never mutual understanding, but capitulation. The second response, and this one operates on a longer time scale, treat any instance of this specific violation as categorically more serious than almost any other kind of relational conflict, even if it initially seems smaller or less dramatic than other things that have happened in the relationship. This requires overriding an instinct many people have, which is to weigh offenses by their apparent size or drama rather than by what they actually target. A single instance of someone calmly, persistently trying to convince you that something you clearly witnessed didn't happen the way you know it happened deserves more weight, not less, than a loud argument about something genuinely disputable, because the target of the violation, Jaim, your fundamental trust in your own mind, is so much more foundational than almost anything else that could be damaged in a relationship. The third response, and the one that ties everything together, recognize that permanently reclassifying someone after this specific violation, even if it seems like an overreaction to people who don't understand the mechanism, is not harshness. It's self-preservation of the exact same order as protecting yourself from any other kind of genuinely dangerous pattern, and it deserves to be treated with the same seriousness, rather than being second-guessed, simply because the offense doesn't look as dramatic from the outside as other things people tend to forgive. I want to say something important as we close this out, because I think it matters more than any specific tactic we've discussed today. The reason this particular mistake is unforgivable to a super empath isn't cruelty, isn't rigidity, isn't an inability to extend grace. It's the direct, logical consequence of understanding exactly what's actually at stake when someone attempts it. Every other kind of relational offense leaves the super empath's fundamental tools intact, even while it hurts. They can still trust their own perception of what happened, still process the pain accurately, still make a clear-eyed decision about how to respond. This one specific violation targets the tools themselves, which means allowing it to happen even once, without consequence, without permanent reclassification, would mean leaving the door open for the one thing capable of undoing everything else the super empath has ever built. I want to leave you with an image because I think it captures everything we've walked through today better than any explanation could. Picture a compass carried by someone who spent years lost in genuinely disorienting terrain, fog thick enough to obscure every landmark, paths that doubled back on themselves, false trails deliberately laid by people who benefited from keeping them lost. For a long time, this person had no reliable way to know which direction was actually true north, and every attempt to trust their own sense of direction got undermined again and again, until they could barely take a single step without doubting whether they were moving toward safety or further into danger. And then eventually, after enormous effort, they finally found or built something they could actually trust, a compass, calibrated carefully, tested repeatedly against landmarks that turned out to be exactly where the compass said they'd be, proven accurate again and again, until, for the first time in longer than they could remember. They could finally take a step without that paralyzing uncertainty, trusting finally that when the needle pointed somewhere, that direction was actually real. Now imagine someone new arriving in this person's life, and instead of respecting the difficult journey it took to build that trusted compass, this new person, for reasons of their own comfort or convenience, tries to convince our traveler that the compass is broken, that north isn't actually where it's pointing, that they should trust this new person's sense of direction instead, even when every landmark the compass has ever pointed toward has turned out to be exactly right. This is not a small request. This is not an ordinary disagreement about which path to take. This is asking someone who nearly died, lost in the fog, to hand over the single tool that finally let them navigate out of it, based on nothing more than this new person's insistence that the tool is wrong, precisely in the moment it's working exactly as it should. A person who has rebuilt their own compass at enormous cost, after years of being deliberately misdirected, will not hand it over again. Not out of stubbornness, not out of an inability to be wrong, but because they know, with a clarity that took everything they had to earn, exactly what it costs to walk without one. And they are simply, finally, unwilling to risk that particular darkness again for anyone who's already shown they're willing to spin the needle themselves, the moment it becomes inconvenient for it to point where it actually truly does.